Now, that congregation is having a summer series this summer on the Sermon on the Mount. And David Light called me and asked me if I would present one of those lessons. So I'm going to do that. It'll be within the next couple of weeks. And I thought I would bring that lesson here before I delivered it there. And the text they want me to speak on is Matthew 5:33 through 37, where Jesus said, "Swear not at all." Now, I want us to look at this and make sure we understand what Jesus is teaching, but also make sure we understand what he's not teaching when we look at this. Now, here's the text. Here's the text. "Again, ye have heard that it hath been said by them of old time, Thou shalt not forswear thyself, but shalt perform unto the Lord thine oaths. But I say unto you, swear not at all, neither by heaven, for it is God's throne, nor by earth, for it is his footstool, neither by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great King. Neither shalt thou swear by thy head, because thou canst not make one hair white or black. But let your communication be yea, yea, and nay, nay. For whatsoever is more of these cometh of evil." Jesus was speaking in the long ago. Today he wouldn't say, neither can you make your hair white or black, because people are changing their hair color all the time today, aren't they? I see young girls sometimes trying to make their hair gray, and older ladies trying to make it black. So people do this commonly. But we know what Jesus is saying here, and it's useless, some of these things by which men are trying to swear. Now, part of the Sermon on the Mount. Let's put this in context. I want you to notice how Jesus said this, and he says something like this several times throughout the Sermon on the Mount. "Ye have heard that it hath been said by them of old time, but I say unto you." The Sermon on the Mount has been called the most profound sermon that has ever been preached. And indeed, it's a sermon coming from God himself, coming from Jesus. And so here we have God's sermon being preached in his Son, Jesus Christ. And so it's got to be profound. But what does it mean? And what is its significance? And you can read in commentaries where people have said, what Jesus is doing on the Sermon on the Mount is giving a reinterpretation of the law of Moses. Well, that's not what he's doing. That's not what this is about. In fact, he's not actually quoting from the law of Moses. He's quoting from what they have heard that the law of Moses said. Now, that's important to keep in perspective as we look at this. Some of this sounds like quotes directly from the law, but it's what they had heard about the law from the scribes and the Pharisees. And the scribes and the Pharisees thought, we've got tradition as our authority for what the law of Moses really means. And Jesus would say, ye have heard that it hath been said by them of old time. You've heard the traditions about the law of Moses. And in those traditions, a lot of time they had perverted the meaning of the law. Like Jesus is going to say this, but I say unto you. You've heard all this. They'd heard those things. And then Jesus says, but I say unto you. Well, they were astonished at his authority. Matthew 7:28 and 29. This authority comes from this, I say. He put his authority right up against and then over and above the authority of the scribes that were delivering to them the traditions about that old law. And he is not really contrasting his understanding of the old law, which he did understand it. In fact, it was his law, wasn't it? I mean, there was another Sermon on the Mount on Mount Sinai when God spake these things. It was God's law to start with. So certainly God knew what he meant when he said that. But that's not what he is doing. That old law was for Israel, and it kept them separate from all the nations of the earth. But before we come to the Sermon on the Mount, we see in Matthew 4 and verse 23 that Jesus went about all Galilee in their synagogues preaching the gospel of the kingdom. The kingdom was not just for Israel. The kingdom is for all nations, all of us. What Jesus preached is important to everyone, Jew and Gentile, and that makes it important to everyone that is in this room at this time. And what Jesus is contrasting is what they had heard that the scribes had said about the old law, and that's where they were at that time. And he's not trying to restore the old law to its original intent, although he could have done that. He's contrasting where they were now based on what they had heard from the traditions of the scribes to what he is teaching about the kingdom that is to come. A new dispensation and a new law. And it's going to require something new out of man. Because according to their traditions, they saw that old law written and engraved in stones as external. It was just out there. Here they were, and they would just kind of keep it externally. What the new law would involve is not something external, but a law written on the heart. It had to be internal. Now, the old law was supposed to be internal too, but by the traditions of the scribes, it had become something external to them. But the new law would be written on the heart. Sometimes people talk about, where do you keep the letter of the Spirit? As though they could keep the spirit of the law without keeping the letter of the law. How could you keep the spirit of a law without keeping the letter of it? What Paul is talking about, not in the letter, he's talking about not in the letter only, but in the spirit also. Not just something external, but something internal. And on the Sermon on the Mount, he emphasizes over and over and over that this has to be something that we take to our hearts and not just some outside ordinance that we keep externally. It's got to change the heart. And one of the ways he emphasized this in this sermon is by going over and over and over certain examples of what he's talking about here. And so here he's talking about swearing. Swear not at all. Look what he says in Matthew 5, 19 through 20. And this kind of helps understand the significance of the Sermon on the Mount. It's the kingdom of heaven he's talking about. Whosoever therefore shall break one of these least commandments and shall teach men so, he shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whosoever shall do and teach them, the same shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I say unto you, except your righteousness exceed the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, ye shall in no case enter into the kingdom of heaven. He's talking about the kingdom of heaven. The least of these commandments are not the least of Moses' commandments. It's the least of the commandments he's giving them that will apply to the kingdom of heaven. And when he says your righteousness has to exceed the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees. Now listen, you got to remember, those Pharisees, they prided themselves in being strict adherents to every ordinance of the law. And you got to do better than that. How are you going to do better than that? You're going to keep it closer and more rigid than they did? That's not the point. It's a superior law. It's a superior righteousness. And while the Pharisees were all interested in keeping everything externally, it'll be superior to keep this superior law from the heart. That's the significance of what Jesus is teaching on the Sermon on the Mount. And so the least of these commandments and the exceed the righteousness. Now let's go to this. You've heard that it hath been said by them of old time. Here's the example. Thou shalt not forswear thyself. Now that is not a quotation from the law of Moses, but there's things in the law of Moses that they derived that commandment from. And when it says thou shalt not, that takes us back to that Sermon on the Mount Sinai, not this mountain Galilee, but that old Sermon on the Mount. God spake from that mountain. He spake with thunder and lightnings, and it frightened the people. That those 10 commandments were first given by the voice of God from Mount Sinai, and it scared them. They could not stand it. They said, we can't hear these things. Moses, you go up there and get the law and bring it to us. We can't take this hearing directly from God. And so that's how Moses went up to get the tablets of stone. But it was first spoken by Mount Sinai. And over and over and over, he's saying, thou shalt not. Now, he didn't exactly say, thou shalt not forswear thyself. But he said 2 things that could lead to this. Exodus 20 and verse 7. Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless that taketh his name in vain. And then Exodus 20 and verse 16. Thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor. Now, both of these had to do with what we say. I mean, they're reminders of us that we need to guard our speech. One of the ways that we can take the name of the Lord in vain is by, well, I swear by the name of the Lord, and then don't do what you said. It's false swearing. And so that's one way you're taking the name of the Lord in vain, by forswearing. It's not the only way. There are other ways to do that. James says in James chapter 3 and verse 2, in many things we offend all. If any man offend not in word, the same is a perfect man, and able also to bridle the whole body. We've got to watch what we say. He says in James 3 and verse 8, the tongue can no man tame. It's an unruly evil full of deadly poison. I tell you, if your heart's not right, it's going to show up in your tongue, isn't it? We've got to get the heart right. If we're going to try to get the tongue right, you can't tame the tongue and let the heart go free. It won't work that way. James 5 and verse 12 emphasizes this. He says, above all, but above all things, my brethren. Now that puts an emphasis here. Swear not. Neither by heaven, neither by earth, neither by any other oath. But let your yea be yea and your nay be nay, lest you fall into condemnation. Above all. Well, that's one of the things we've got to guard about our tongue. Now, forswearing, that's false swearing. That's one way that we can use the tongue in the wrong way and take the name of the Lord in vain. It's not the only way. It's not the only way. There's other ways. Now, what we read, Psalm 90 and verse 3 is, let them praise thy great and terrible name. It is holy. God's name is holy. Psalm 111 and verse 9, holy and reverend is his name. The Jews were so particular about reverencing God's name that when they would copy the law and they would come to the name for Jehovah, they wouldn't write it. They're afraid they might make a blot or something on that name, and they'd get a new pen that had never been used. And they would take that pen, and instead of writing Jehovah, they'd write the name for Lord, Adonai, and then they'd get rid of that pen and never use it again and try to completely avoid the name so as not to take it in vain. Well, that was an extreme, but it does show the reverence toward that name. Now, swear words. You ever heard swear words? Now, when I was growing up, we associated swear words with curse words, and we called them cuss words. And we were taught not to say cuss words. Now, my mama, if she were to catch a cuss word on us, she'd take a rag and put it on the dish soap, and buddy, we'd get our mouth washed out with soap. That's right. And we learned there's certain things you don't say, or you're going to have a mouth washed out with soap. Now, I didn't get my mouth washed out with soap for a cuss word. I did do it for sassing one time. And you don't sass mama. You find that out real quick. You know, there's just certain, and you don't talk to your mama that way. But that same thing would be applied to cuss words. You just didn't say that. And there was a line drawn there. You didn't say it. And you know those cuss words, and you know not to say them. And the best way to learn not to say them is to don't think them. You got to get to the heart. You know, you think, well, I'll just think it, not say it. That won't work, because something's going to happen, and boy, it'll slip right out. So don't think them, and you don't say them. But then we'll say these other words. Look at them up there. I don't want to say them, but you know what they are. And there's a whole host of words we could put on that. What are you saying? Now, it bothers me. People don't think they're cussing, but they'll sometimes say, well, Jesus Christ. And they're not talking about Jesus. Holy and reverend is his name. And then they'll say, oh my God. And they don't think they're saying, well, what about what God means? And I don't think they realize how insulting and disrespectful it is to say things like that. Now think about it this way. Men, think about this. Would you want them using your mother's name like that? Or to blurt out your wife's name and something like that? No, you wouldn't want that. Or your daughter? Think about that. They're taking your daughter's name and using it like a byword? You wouldn't stand for it. You'd put a stop to that. And so think about the name of God in what we say. But these other words with substitute, are they really helping much? I mean, everyone, what are you saying when you say those things? What are you texting? When you text OMG, what do you think you're doing? And so we can purify that. We can clean our speech up. And we'll do it from the heart. We're going to do it. It's not just because the preacher said, oh, look here, here's a list of things we can't say. Don't do that. Don't do that. In your heart, think about how we're to reverence the name of our holy God. And watch what we say. We're going to be held accountable for every idle word. Every idle word that men shall speak, they shall give an account thereof in the day of judgment. For by thy word shalt thou be justified, and by thy word shalt thou be condemned. And Colossians 4 and verse 6, let your speech be always with grace, seasoned with salt. Do you know how you ought to answer every man? You can take care and clean up your speech and get your heart right and get some of these words out of our vocabulary. But in the Sermon on the Mount, he's talking about taking an oath. That's the example he's using. I'm going to have to move on here. I'm going to go through this faster than I intended to. So, okay, listen real intently, okay? Since I'm going to have to move on. It's going to be your job for me to do. I don't want to preach 2 sermons on this. Leviticus 27. You got a whole chapter on how to fulfill an oath. You take an oath, and a lot of time the oath implied that when this is accomplished, I'm going to make this sacrifice. That's how you fulfill the oath. by making a sacrifice. And so Leviticus 27 goes into detail about that. Numbers chapter 30 and verse 2. If a man vow a vow to the Lord or swear an oath to bind his soul with a bond, he shall not break his word. He shall do according to all that proceedeth out of his mouth. And this included swearing. Deuteronomy 6:13 and 10:20. Thou shalt fear the Lord thy God and serve him, and shalt swear by his name. So swearing was part of the old law. Now, I'm not going to read all this. We don't have time. I want to, but Ecclesiastes 5, 1 through 7. You go up to the Temple Mount, and the temple's there, and everything, and you watch what you say when you go up there. A lot of people might go up there and just overwhelmed with all, and make some oath to God. You better pay it if you make it. And so that's why he says in Ecclesiastes 5 and verse 1, keep thy foot when thou goest in the house of God. What does it mean, keep your foot? Well, we say it this way. You watch your step. You watch your step. And in particularly, this really has to do with watching your tongue. You be careful what you say when you're up there on that Temple Mount. Be not rash with thy mouth. Let thy words be few. And this whole thing is talking about making vows. Verse 4, when thou vowest a vow to God, defer not to pay it. You go up there and you say, boy, I'm gonna do. And then you say, you better do it. And you better just keep your mouth shut, because you're going to obligate yourself by what you say. God expects you to fulfill your oaths. They found a way around it. See, you could swear by really big things, and that was really binding. But if you swore by something like all that, I mean, you could kind of get out of those little swearing things. You know, we sometimes do that with lies, the black lie and the white lies, though there's some difference. Well, there's I guess a black swear and a white swear, and then they're just little things. Here's what the foolishness they got into that Jesus was dealing with. Woe unto ye blind guides, which say, whosoever shall swear by the temple is nothing, but whoso swear by the gold of the temple, he's a debtor. You fools and blind, for whether is greater, the gold or the temple that sanctifieth the gold? And whoso swear by the altar, it's nothing, but who swear by the gift that is on the altar, he is guilty. You fools and blind, for whatever is greater, the gift or the altar that sacrificed the gift? Whoso therefore shall swear by the altar sweareth by it and the things thereon. Who swear by the temple sweareth by it and him that dwelleth therein. And he that shall swear by heaven sweareth by the throne of God, by him that sitteth on the throne. Don't give me this. Well, I didn't swear by something very big, so I'm not really very bound. That's why Jesus said, if you say yes and no, you mean yes and no, whether you swear anything or not. Don't give me this. I swore by something greater, or swear by something lesser. So swear not at all. That sounds comprehensive and absolute. Then explain this. Why did the Holy Spirit have Paul write these things? God is my witness. I say the truth. In Christ I lie not. My conscience bear me witness in the Holy Ghost. But as God is true, our word toward you is not yea and nay. I call God for a record of my soul. Would to God you could bear with me in a little folly. As the truth of Christ is in me, no man shall stop me. Now the things which are right unto you, behold, before God I lie not. For God is my record. How do you harmonize swear not at all with what the Holy Spirit had Paul do when he wrote his epistles? How do you harmonize it with this? Hebrews 6, 16 and 17. For men verily swear by the greater, and an oath for confirmation to them is an end of strife, wherein God willing more abundantly to show unto the heir of the promise the immutability of his counsel, confirmed it by an oath. What about Jesus? Verily, verily, I say unto you. That means truly, truly. If it's just yes and no, why does he have to say truly, truly? You know, he did it 5 times in the Sermon on the Mount. Verily I say unto you, till heaven and earth pass, one jot or one tittle shall in no wise pass from the law till all be fulfilled. Verily I say unto thee, thou shalt by no means come out thence till thou hast paid the utmost farthing. And 3 times, verily I say unto you, they have their reward. Now he said, swear not at all, just say yes or no. And then he goes right on and says, verily, 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 verily. How do you pull that together? Here's what Jesus is doing. When he says, swear not at all, he's using the comprehensive absolute for rhetorical emphasis. He's doing what James, his little brother, would do when he said, and above all. Why did he do that? He's emphasizing that. And I think we need to remember that, lest we come to some conclusions about this swear not at all that are not warranted. Swear not at all. Sometimes people called to the witness stand. Put your hand on the Bible, hold up your right hand. Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Now, what do? What are you going to do? Say, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to swear at all. Some people say, well, maybe for conscience sake, this will work. They don't want to swear at all. They say, well, I'll affirm, or I promise, or maybe some of us, well, I'll swanny. What are we trying to do? We're trying to avoid that word swear, but we're just using another word for the same thing. And that is not necessary. Of course we're going to tell the truth. And I tell you, you don't have to put a Bible out there and put my hand on it and tell me, and I don't have to say it, I'm going to tell the truth. I've already decided. If I say yes, it means yes. And if I say no, it means no. Regardless of whether I say truly, truly, or before God, or put my hand on anything, or even say the word swear, I'm going to tell the truth. And that's what Jesus is telling us to do. And he's using this for emphasis to say, don't think. Here's what we did when we were kids. Did you ever do this? You're telling a fib. You're going to tell a lie, but it's all right because you had your fingers crossed behind your back. I got my fingers. Said, yeah, I said that, but I had my fingers crossed. That doesn't work. That doesn't work, does it? But that's how childish they were doing. And so you might respond to that, just tell the truth. Just tell the truth. Any effort to evade telling the truth is sin, and it starts in the heart. And so swear not at all. Here's how we might put this, and I'm not going to call this a translation, but to help appreciate what Jesus is saying here when he says swear not at all. Swear not any weaker, lesser, false, deceptive, or flippant oaths. Just don't do that at all. Don't do that at all. We better be very careful what we say. We're held accountable for what we say. There's 2 great vows I have made. One of them is this. And I vowed to take Lori for my wife. I made a promise before all who were gathered and before God. She would be mine and I would be hers. And we'd be faithful one to another. And a divorce is breaking a promise, isn't it? That's breaking a promise. There's another vow I made. I made it that night when as a very young man I came forward and told the church that was gathered, I believe Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. And I was baptized into Christ. I'm making a promise to God. I'm going to follow your law. I'm going to go your way. We're bound to that promise. I said yes. And let your yes be yes. Have you made that promise? You need to make that promise to God and count the cost and keep it. And let your yes be yes. And if you need to make things right, you have an opportunity to look forward while we stand and sing.